Welcome to Unmissables, a podcast about how leaders in product, design, and technology are building what's next, while navigating complexity, their creative ambitions, and the kinds of questions that rarely have easy answers, but always deserve better ones. I'm your host, Ariba Jahan, a product and innovation executive. And on this show, we explore how we can build smarter and more intentional products, systems, and features. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your favorite podcast players. We often talk about the future like it's something very, very far away. But the future isn't something we wait for. It's something that we build through the questions that we ask today, the stories we tell, and the decisions we choose to make, especially when it comes to moments of change. In this episode, I'm talking to Tameka Vasquez, a futurist, a strategist, speaker, and educator whose work makes Foresight feel less like buzzwords and more like a tool for building what's possible with humanity in mind. She's the founder of The Future Quo, an advisory firm helping organizations design futures centered on a higher purpose for people and planet. Her background spans everything from marketing, systems design, and even academia. She's held leadership roles at organizations like Sidewalk Labs and taught at Columbia University. We talk about how futures work became her calling, how she helps companies move from a place of crisis response to long-term clarity, why vision and foresight shouldn't live in a silo, and how trend chasing is actually pretty limiting, and why holding space for multiple truths is actually part of the real work here. So if you've been feeling pulled between what's urgent and what's important, come pause with us and let's get into it. Hi, Tameka.
Hello.
I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since we first met. And I think what's super exciting is there's not a lot of people doing futures work or talking about it in these times. And I think oftentimes there's this tension between, I don't have time to think about the future, or like, future is all I can think about. And I think I'm really excited to kind of just like unpack that a bit with you today. So I think before we jump in, what'll be great is to hear, how did you even get started with your futures work?
How did I even get started with futures work? By accident, probably like most career paths these days. No, but I have always been a storyteller, and I have always desired a career where I could tell stories about the world and how it's evolving and how it's changing. And I found my way in a marketing career in the tech industry, and like that, opened up so many doors for me. And I stayed there for 14 years because it opened up so much for me. For me, it was always about like, what are we actually doing? What's the world that we are occupying right now, and what's the world that we want to leave behind? That's always been the underlying motive for me, because that's the thing that I think creates more purpose and creates more of a sense of direction when you're starting to evaluate whether it's career opportunities, whether it's where you live, whether it's, the relationships that you form. Everything is really about a future in some way that you are trying to occupy. And so I think operating with that general ethos is something that I take more seriously now that I realize that it is in fact a career path.
Yeah.
But that's really why, like, I love introducing new ideas. I love, really being able to understand the world from different perspectives. I'm a student of history and a student of people and culture. And so, when you're multidisciplinary like that, there are probably but so many career paths that would really keep you grounded and keep you curious and interested. So futures work offers that in many, many ways.
Amazing. I feel like I have a bunch of questions later on where we're going to kind of dig into your own career journey a bit more. Because I think right now, what we're seeing is like less and less traditional career paths, and more people really creating their own career paths and thinking about like, well, what's the future for me? What are my strengths? Or understanding that you don't have to go the traditional path to learn. I think when it comes to futures, there's a lot of terminologies and vocabulary, right? And you and I talked about this, like sometimes language is what feels like becomes a blocker. It feels like the language is there to kind of keep certain people out of certain work. And I think before we talk more about applying futures and demystifying futures, it'll be great to kind of unpack some of the definitions. Why don't I do this? I'll read out the three classical definitions of the three terms that exist, and then I'd love to hear how you typically define all of them or one of them. Like, what do you lean more into?
Okay.
So for our listeners, there is traditionally three terminologies: futures thinking, strategic foresight, and futures design. Oftentimes you'll see them be used interchangeably, but they're actually different. So futures thinking is more about a mindset and practice that explores multiple possible futures, not to predict them, but to better prepare for those futures. It's about identifying signals of change and expanding what's possible beyond today's assumptions. So that's one. And then the next terminology here is strategic foresight. So strategic foresight is more of a formalized process. So we've had the mindset, now it's the process, and it's about how you're using research, signals, and scenario planning to help organizations make better long-term decisions. This can often include things like plausible futures, scenario modeling, as well as vision setting. And then the last one is futures design. This is more about application. So this is how you might apply strategic foresights in a creative approach to then shape what the future should be. So it includes tools from design thinking and foresight practice coming together. It also can sometimes include prototyping these different scenarios and pathways. So I say all that to help our listeners to kind of like get grounded in this conversation. And I would love to hear, out of those three, is there a certain definition you typically use, or are you like, Ariba, I don't even use any of those definitions? We'd just love to hear, like, how do you typically define or explain this work for people who might have heard the term and is already navigating change in their daily work?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I agree with those definitions. I think
Yeah.
if you care about the different purposes and the distinct methodologies, then the definitions you just offered are correct, right?
Okay.
I think of strategic foresight as being more technical in nature. And
Mm.
so there are more frameworks and more systematic ways of doing that work because strategic foresight was born out of basically military strategy. And so much of how corporations and organizations that have adopted strategic foresight as a practice, so much of how they do it still has a lot of that kind of tone of like, we're trying to mitigate risk or we're trying
Yeah.
to scan the horizon and see what potential threats might be out there. And so
Right.
it kind of has this undertone of
More of a
militaristic thinking to
prevention.
it.
Right.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
little bit more of that, because they're trying to secure whatever their competitive advantage is,
Right.
basically. Whereas I think I bucket futures thinking and futures design together a lot because I think that's more of a mindset and more of a creative approach to just exploring possibilities. So the interesting thing is for me, I actually, unless I'm talking to fellow futurists, I never really use the terminologies or the definitions explicitly because I think part of what I learn in this practice, because it is such a niche area, is that we could be a bit intimidating to people who are not exposed to that terminology. And I think it's really important for me because I work with organizations across different industries and some of them may have a sense of what they think I do and most
Mm-hmm.
of them don't. So what I try to do is create a foundation for us to just talk about the future in general, right? Because
Yeah.
I think when we get into some of these definitions, I think what we're trying to solve for is like, what are the outcomes that you're hopeful for? So with strategic
Mm-hmm.
foresight, the outcome would be to have a very clear plan of how you're going to be able to secure your standing in the market, how you're going to be able to create a plan for the next 3, 5, 10 years, et cetera. With futures thinking, it's really going to be more about how do you now start to assess what is on the horizon, what possibilities are emerging, what are some of the cycles and patterns that are happening in our society, and like what does it
Mm-hmm.
mean for you, and like how do you embed yourself in this mindset of always thinking ahead, but not in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like a time frame, but sort of in terms of emergence and how things are evolving in our world. And then if the outcome you're hoping for would be more in terms of like, I want to create products, I want to design and prototype
Mm-hmm.
things, I
Mm-hmm.
want to speculate what a world in a distant future could possibly look like. And I want to have more of a creative discipline around the
Yeah.
things that I am creating. Like that's when you'll probably get into futures design. So depending on the outcomes that you're hopeful for, it
Yeah.
could matter, like what you call the thing. But I think the thing I realize is it's really more important that we support people, especially in organizations that have more traditional cultures or they're
Yeah.
more risk averse, they're not as creative. It's really important that we help them understand like this is a set of frameworks, right? Like this is a wide range of tools that depending on the things that you are trying to achieve as an organization, I can almost guarantee there is a way to use futures thinking and futures design and foresight or whatever you want to call it to help you drive some of those
Right.
outcomes. But I don't care that you don't know those words. What I care about
Mm-hmm.
is that you're open and willing to engage in a conversation around emergence, a conversation around possibility, a
Mm-hmm.
conversation around, you know, creating a path forward for yourself, for your industry, et cetera. That matters a hell of a lot more. So I try to lean into those things in terms of what's
Yeah,
our intent here, and not so
absolutely.
much the actual definitions, but I do agree with the ones you provided.
I feel like the reason I wanted to even start with language is because I feel like when it comes to jargon, or sometimes it can feel like jargon if you feel like it's not within your discipline.
Mhm.
Or maybe if you do a quick Google search and then you realize like this is a whole discipline. Am I even
Yeah.
equipped to like touch this, right?
Yeah.
And that's how sometimes access gets prevented, right? It makes you feel like, oh, this is not for me. This is not for
Yeah.
me to apply because I'm not traditionally trained in this. So, and I think that's what we talked about in terms of like how do we open the language so people realize like we're all allowed to and should be thinking about the future and applying
Absolutely.
futures thinking into our work. So, what's a misconception about futures thinking that you think more people need to challenge?
I mean, it's kind of what you just said. I think one of
Okay.
the biggest misconceptions is that you have to be sort of trained in order to think about the future. And I think that, you know, the profession, I think in some ways has created, whether it's certifications or degree programs and things like that, it's created these pathways to give people more of an academic foundation if they are
Mm-hmm.
interested in really, really going deep into this work. Like I do believe I got certified in strategic foresight, you know, from the University of Houston. So I do believe in like taking on more
Yeah.
of the academic approach, especially in the early days when it can kind of feel a little bit messy. But where I just have strong disagreements is I don't think that that is a prerequisite to you being able to involve yourself in this work or to you being able to apply these methodologies to your work, right? Like it has to be more democratic than it is. And I say that because I think that when we engage people actively in what are possibilities that are emerging in our world because of some of the trends that we are seeing, or how do we now start to assess who and what we are about
Mm-hmm.
because we are seeing an inflection point in our society that we could not have anticipated? Like, the more we can engage people in these conversations, I think the more you can start to have people just be willing to explore an unknown. And I think one of the biggest I would say flaws that we also have in this work is I think we use a lot of terminology that discourages people from engaging with the work. So, for example, you'll find a lot of futurists will talk about the acronym VUCA. And VUCA
Yeah.
is just an
Mm-hmm.
acronym that stands for volatile, uncertain,
Mm-hmm.
complex, and ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you say the future is VUCA, that's not untrue. It is, right? The future is inherently uncertain and complicated
Mm-hmm.
and all of those things. Those things are true. But when we lean into that terminology and we use that language, it really triggers kind of like this innate human resistance to even
Mm-hmm.
stepping into this kind of messy space because it makes people feel like, well, the future is something I just don't really want to think about. So I'm just going to deal with like right now and think about the very short term or think about the things I can immediately control. And then that kind of it strips us all, I think, of a wider range of
Yeah.
possibilities for a world or the many worlds that we can create for ourselves and each other. And so I really try not to lean into those kinds of frameworks and terminologies because they can be so intimidating or because it doesn't invite people into conversation. And if I've learned
Yeah.
nothing else from this work, it cannot be done in isolation in a research lab. It cannot be done, you know, on an innovation team in a silo. This work has to be done in deep collaboration with people who have the same intention, even if they don't quite know how we're going to get there, but they're
Yeah.
coming in with a willing spirit and an intention to understand how the world is shifting, understand the trends, you know, but turn that into a conversation around what does this mean for us right now in terms of how we can show up, in terms of who we want to be, in terms of the kinds of products and services that we're launching into the world? Like, you don't invite people in, when you have these kinds of frameworks or terminologies that make the future seem like this nebulous, scary space that you either have to control or get out of the way. I just disagree with that kind of mindset. And I think a lot of that is seeped into the way that futures work can be positioned sometimes.
I totally agree. I also feel like acronyms like that, while they are kind of there as a tool to get you going, I think if you stop right there, then what
Yeah.
you're creating is a sense that future is definitive. Versus if you
Yes.
treat it more like a tool as a starting point to get you going, then and stay open to what else you might uncover, then at least it leads into possibilities, cross
Yeah.
pollination, and to your point, a lot of co-creation with
Yeah.
others so that more can emerge, right? Because you lose out on that if the tool is used as more definitive
Exactly.
versus as an opener. So, you've already started talking about this in terms of like biggest blockers preventing people and companies from engaging into this kind of work. I'm curious about how you actually approach futures work. Like, walk me through it. Like, if I, or, if we were collaborating on a piece of work together, like, and I've said, you know what, I don't know what this is, but I trust you. You will help guide me. Walk me through a little bit of your process.
Oh my goodness. Yes. I love talking about this.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, most of the time, just to give a little bit of context,
Mhm.
most of the time I'm working with an executive or an executive team that's looking to launch a new vision for the future, right?
Yeah.
And the reasons that they're doing that is because they're facing some kind of major inflection point. So whether it's because of pressures from regulatory or political pressures, or they're dealing with societal changes and norms, or they're dealing with leadership changes within their company. I worked
And
with a
not
company
that,
that
and not like that's not happening everywhere right now.
yeah. I mean, literally, it's when I launched this practice 3 years ago, it
Yeah.
was obviously happening, but it's like completely supercharged. It's a completely new world 3 years later. So it's just
Yeah.
interesting to see. But I make that point because, in terms of context, it's important to understand like a lot of the times what drives organizations to say, like, all right, we might want to consider this approach is because they're facing some kind of
Right.
inflection point. So I just wanted to give that context. And a lot of the reasons why they find themselves unable to navigate it isn't because they don't have smart people or they don't have tools and capabilities. A lot of the times they're just really tethered to the status quo. So the reason I named the business The Future Quo is because I really wanted to show people that in order for us to unlock new visions for the future, we have to break free from the status quo. So
Yeah.
whatever that may mean behaviors, mindsets, processes, strategies that you just rinse and repeat every year. It could mean a whole host of things, but what that typically involves in terms of the work that I get to step into, and I always work with collaborators and different subject matter experts, so they've certainly helped to enrich my approaches here. But for me, it's really about research and incubating new ideas. So what that means is typically we are doing a lot of trends research to understand what is emerging that impacts your industry, your business, or the spaces that you are trying to enter. And how is that exposing new
Mm.
possibilities that are sometimes unexpected? So you're not
Mhm.
necessarily able to see it because you're probably not looking at the widest scope possible. So for example, if you're a manufacturing client, you might just be looking at trends in manufacturing. But what we try to do is we take a much broader approach to actually look at a wide range of industries to really try to get a sense of what is just emerging in general,
Yep.
like in the world, and how does that now start to expose a certain kind of truth that you might be overlooking because you're only looking in the tunnel vision of just a singular industry. And
Yeah.
so because we're industry agnostic, like that's kind of our privilege in being able to look across. But that's our first step, is to really try to uncover what are the truths that you may be overlooking that don't allow you to move with confidence, right? So let's first do the research to really understand that and unpack that, and use that as a space of incubation to start to really assess new possibilities, new opportunity spaces for you as a business. And then the next kind of area of work that we do is really around facilitation and strategy. So it's really
Hmm.
about how do we now use what we just learned to spark conversation? How do you now bring your stakeholders to the table so that instead of them waiting until you're going to reveal this thing that they may or may not agree with, how do you invite them in early when the thing is still fuzzy? The ideas that you're considering are still, they're not super solidified yet.
Yeah.
Bring people in at that stage. I strongly believe that because I think when you can start to spark those conversations early and you're bringing in research, you're bringing in findings, you're bringing in opportunity spaces, you can kind of get some momentum. And don't get me wrong, it's never like perfect, but we've dealt with instances where, of course you may face resistance. Of course, people might be apprehensive about what you're talking about. But more often than not, what I've learned is if you invite people early into the process at the
Yeah.
learning stage, we're all asking questions together. And so we can kind of start to think about, okay, we're at this inflection point. Everybody knows it. Now, based on what we're learning, what might that mean in terms of certain decisions that we might want to make? And what we do in that is a lot of narrative shaping. It's just
Mm.
as important for you to tell a story or several stories about what is emerging, what are possibilities, what, the what if questions, those kinds of provocations that just get people a little bit uncomfortable and squirming in
Inspired.
their seat.
Yeah.
But yeah, it could really
Yeah.
start to inspire them to just think in new ways. And so we do a lot of work on the storytelling and the narrative to really shape, how do you invite these stakeholders to actually believe in a
In that
possibility,
future. Right.
Yeah, and start
Yeah.
to rally around what could be next for you. So that's like 90% of the work is that kind of research, the sort of incubation, coming up with those new opportunity spaces, facilitating conversations with decision makers, and then developing the strategy of, okay, now how do you move
Yeah.
forward? What is the path forward and what is that going to entail in terms of strategy around communication, strategy around change management, like all of these
Product
things that
development. Right.
product development. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Like so much
Mhm.
of the conversation is around, potentially entering a new market. Like all of the outcomes vary. But again, the original intent is usually because like we have to find a way forward in a really crazy nebulous time. And, here is a way that futures thinking and futures design allows us to identify those possibilities. So like that's 90% of the work that we do. And of course, there are other kind of one-off scenarios where we might just do a lot of like just sessions to inspire thinking.
Mhm.
We might do a lot of, we do some work around like world building and kind of co-creation sessions, and those tend to
Mhm.
be inherently creative, but most of the work is kind of in that moving from research to like deep, deep strategy work to actually
Mhm.
having those difficult conversations that could yield a very clear path forward for you, hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like, I think I loved your point around looking at the future, looking at possible and plausible futures through a lens of like what is happening around us, whether it's within our category, outside of the category, and like tangential areas that you may not be looking at. Also for human behavior, right? Like,
Oh,
I feel
yeah.
like human behavior is changing all the time. A great example of it being done too much is like when the Tinder swipe happened and then everybody incorporated swipes because they're like, well,
Mhm.
people are used to swipes now, so we must do it, right? So that becomes a more reactive approach versus the more maybe emerging approach to that could have been looking at the fact that, oh, like people want choice and people want autonomy of choosing and they want options. They want to be able to customize and personalize. So looking at it through the lens of just like adding the same feature because everybody else is doing it versus looking at like a human behavior and human behavior lens and understanding like what's happening here. It's funny, I'm using Tinder as the example today, but we'll stick with it.
It's
But
actually a good example. Yeah.
it's fun. I also love that mushy middle where you do the research and then you uncover insights, and some of the insights may be things people do not want to hear, right? Really like what you're talking about in terms of like narrative building. It's
Yeah.
like your point of contact at an organization may be the person who's like really bought into it, but now you got to get everybody else bought into it and everybody else to feel like they can participate in this design of the future and informing the future vision. So it feels like when we talk about vision, there's like maybe an organizational vision, but then there's
Yeah.
also the vision for how do you want this future work to be? What
Yeah.
would you like to accomplish? What do you hope it uncovers? How do you want to rally people together? Do you not want to rally people together? All of those things. So it feels like there's two visions that I can imagine for this. So that makes me think about, we've talked about this where there's a mismatch between what companies say they stand for in terms of vision setting and then the action of it, and the gap often persists. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like how people get kind of stuck within that and how can they uh how can they navigate?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the right question because this is the kind of question that I think creates the most objections towards futures work. I've certainly heard many times, leaders say like, "Oh, we don't have the luxury to sort of think about the future right now." But, I try to meet people where they are, and I think that the thing organizations are struggling with is just the nature of our capitalist system does kind of require a lot of immediacy,
Hmm.
a lot of urgency, a lot of being able to quote unquote put out fires. And so we've built careers off of our ability to be efficient and, kind of direct and all of this stuff. And I just don't think that that's consistent with the way that the world is asking us to operate. Right. And I say that because the world is emerging and converging in ways that like we don't even understand, even
Yeah.
for the likes of us who are spending lots of time in these kind of very human conversations trying to uncover way beyond trends. Because I love what you just said about kind of understanding like the human need behind all of this stuff. Most of the time, just as a quick side note, most of the time in our research, we do stakeholder mapping up front because most of the time what I'm going to ask, a team to allow us to do is invite some of the stakeholders into the actual research phase. So what that means is typically we're interviewing people who might be clients, who
Hmm.
might be users of a product, who might be other collaborators, and people who you might not necessarily be interacting with every day, but they are depending on you to make the right decision, right? So who
Hmm.
are those people? We try to interview those people and trying to get to the source of like what are their core fears and motivations? What are they hoping to solve for? Brings them life in this work that they do. And so
Yeah.
when you start to unpack those very human things, what you realize is there are certain things that are evergreen, that are not trendy or time stamped. And so I don't get caught up in trends. And I think part of what I try to support organizations to think about is when you are not operating with the future in mind, right? And when you don't have a clear vision for a future that you are trying to cultivate and create, you're always going to be at the mercy of trends and you're
Yeah.
always going to be stuck reacting to everything because you won't fully understand what's right for you.
Hmm.
What's the role that you want to play in the landscape that you are in? It's really hard for you to ground yourself in absence of having a clear vision for a future that you are trying to create. So for me, it's like the future is what creates intention, right? The future is what creates purpose. And the future is what creates a blueprint for what guides your decision making. You will know if something is right for you. So just because, all of your competitors might be talking about a thing, we go through these hype cycles with trends all the time. We'll be talking about a thing and it's like, if you don't latch onto this, you're going to get left behind. And we start chasing these short term opportunities and we use a lot of time, energy, and resources against that. But oftentimes we don't fully know why. And so
Yeah.
I think it's just really important to really consider how we cannot be so reactive, especially in a world that I think is really evolving in a way that is begging for more intentionality. The
Yeah.
world is evolving in a way where people are begging for more kind of slowness. And it's not slowness in terms of, kind of
Lag.
laying back and not being productive. When I say slowness, what I'm referring to is really being methodical, having a sense of calm, having a sense of strategic direction. And I
Yeah.
think, that's really what futures work offers you the opportunity to do. Like it's a little bit easier. Ironically, this is something that I think a lot of clients don't understand right up front, but they certainly start to understand it as we start doing the work. Ironically, the further ahead you think, the more
Yeah.
nimble you are today, right?
So
It's a little
so
bit easier.
interesting.
I had a client that we worked with almost 2 years ago who is now kind of facing a different inflection point than when we originally started working. And she texted me the other day to say, like, I'm revisiting like all of the stuff that we came up with 2 years ago. It's actually back in the fold now. It still has relevance now. And it's like, yeah, because it's not time stamped. There,
Yeah.
there are evergreen
Strategic
truths.
foundations.
Yeah, there's a strategic foundation. You will
Yeah.
find yourself at many inflection points. And I would argue you would be able to go back
Hmm.
to some of those original approaches, methodologies, some of those original themes that we started to uncover, the narratives, the stories, the talking points. You'll really find them essential in any moment where you have to now potentially change course or
Yeah.
you have to now deal with just a new reality. And I think the pace of change that we are dealing with in our world right now does not require more short-sightedness or more urgency. It actually requires more slowness. It requires more human-centeredness. It requires a deeper understanding, and it requires just stronger purpose and intention. And so it seems kind of oxymoronish, like it seems counterintuitive, but I truly believe the further ahead you can imagine and the further ahead you can start to conceptualize, especially when you start thinking about like why you're doing this work in the first place, like
Yeah.
if there is a broader mission behind that, you realize like the change is not going to happen overnight, but just because it's not fast does not mean that it's not effective. And so that's just something that I try to coach clients through, because it's not innately how we're taught to show up in a business context, but it's
Yeah.
truly what I think the future of the business environment is going to require.
I think, there's these two stats that I found kind of surprising when I was preparing for this conversation. House Cooper did a study with like global CEOs, and they found that 45% of CEOs don't believe that their business will be viable in 10 years if they stay on their current path, right? I think when you and I were chatting last, you said a number, and I think it was like a 2023 study. So I looked it up, and they were like, oh, so this number is actually increasing.
Gone up.
More,
Yeah.
more people are doubtful of the viability and sustainability of their business if they stay the current course.
Yeah.
And then there's another research done that was by McKinsey, where they found that 87% of executives feel the most amount of pressure to deliver short-term results, even
Yeah.
if it compromises long-term strategy. And I think we're seeing it happen live with Gen AI, right? Like, I think like the AIification of everything around us is happening so fast. I think there's like the technology aspect where technology is evolving so fast, but then the pressure on organizational leaders to like go do the AI. Why aren't we talking about AI? And there's a difference between you as an employee, you as a human being applying AI tools into your work versus the other mandate. There's two mandates, right? There's one is like learn AI, do the AI. AI should be, increasing your productivity in every which way. And then there's the other mandate, which is put AI into your tools, And so suddenly we see that star icon in everything, and it's just like, it's become a visual asset now, right? Like it's a visual artifact. As soon as you see that, you know that this is generative AI, whether you're in a Google platform or you're in Notion or you're in a Microsoft platform, anywhere. I mean, nowadays it's even in LinkedIn, right? And
Yeah.
so I think people are just like grappling with the fact that there's this narrative of like, to your point, if you don't do it, you're going to be left behind. And I think it's so like not a productive mandate, to be honest. So there's the tension of I need to learn it and master it, or else I will be replaced. And
Mhm.
then there's a product level and a brand level where if I'm not leveraging Gen AI into my brand narrative as well as my product portfolio, then we are going to be left behind, right? And I think what you're talking about in terms of reactive versus having a vision, strategic foundation, we're seeing it be in tension right now, right?
Yeah.
Live.
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely seeing the effects of, generations of, and when I say generations, I don't mean in terms of age cohorts, but I mean in terms of just like waves of digital transformation and
Mm-hmm.
innovation, particularly over the last 30 to 40 years. We're definitely on the receiving end now of just a lot of short-sighted thinking,
Yeah.
along the way. And I think it's sad because there's so much potential, for technologies like Gen AI and others. Like I actually did my master's thesis back in 2015 about the impacts and opportunities for cognitive technologies, artificial intelligence on corporate workforces. And like, I can't tell you, nobody wanted to talk to us back then. Nobody wanted to talk to us back then because we were like, oh, we were being asked questions like, what's the business case? And we need to see the ROI. And we weren't even selling,
Yeah. It's early.
AI. Like, yeah, we weren't selling it. We were talking about it. We were trying to understand like the potential use cases. Where is it going to support, analytical thinking, and optimization versus where can it support innovation and creativity and things like that. And so this is literally 10 years ago, which I mean, in the world of tech is like 100 years ago. But it was interesting to see that at that time, there was so much resistance. Like people did not want to talk about this at all.
Tension points and all of that. And now I think we want to make sure listeners can then go do the thing.
Yeah. Although I don't know how they would do the thing because they got to hire somebody to do the thing.
Well, like, how can they start thinking more about the
Yeah,
future,
embedding it.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm definitely down to talk about that because the point, and I can reiterate it, but the point I was trying to make is that basically, like, people weren't willing to talk about this back then because it seemed like it was just like a nice to have. It
Yeah,
didn't seem like
that's
it
right.
was critical.
Yeah.
And so now I do think that people are seeing it as critical,
Yeah.
but in some instances, it may actually just be a nice to have. And so it's kind of like this weird swapping that's happened. And that's the point that I was going to make, because I think a lot of the conversation around like adoption and, trying to see new business cases for it, like it's being done for the purposes of keeping up as opposed to the purposes of actually enhancing the way your organization operates. So in 2015, I was doing my master's thesis on the impacts and opportunities for cognitive technology. So AI in corporate workspaces, and nobody wanted to talk to us back then because even though it was just a decade ago, it was just this kind of far-reaching, Hollywood concept of robots coming and taking over the world. So people just were not open to, talking
Yeah.
about it in this way. And we weren't selling AI, right? We were students trying to study what are potential use cases and areas of impact to support organizations to be more analytical, or to be, to have more optimization in their workflows,
Mhm.
or what are opportunities for us to use it to augment the process of innovation and creativity and things like that. So that was our intention, was to just kind of learn and assess where some of those business cases may be. But for a lot of organizations at that time, it just seemed like this kind of like kooky, nice to have thing. So it wasn't perceived as critical. So it's just really interesting to fast forward now. And you would think that if you are not using this thing, that you are a Luddite, you are going to be left behind and the world's just moving on without you. So it's just so fascinating to see how that narrative just completely flipped, where now it's not a nice to have. Now it's an
It's an
absolute
imperative.
critical, yeah, like area of business. So it's an imperative, to your point. And so I just find that interesting, because I think what we need to do as leaders, I think, is always encourage exploration, and we always need to encourage people to play and to really start to, I'm not opposed to people just diving in, getting their hands dirty and testing out different capabilities. But what we just have to be careful of is, if we don't know the intention, if we don't know why, then what we're experiencing now is like on the back end of lots of short-sighted thinking in the last 30 to 40 years in the business environment. We're seeing profit maximization in ways that just don't make sense, right? Like it does not make sense when we think about, what are we in a rush to do? I don't quite understand like what
Yeah.
all the urgency is about. I do believe we have to be open and mindful of technological advancement. I also think we have to be prioritizing the human impact and the societal impact that we inevitably are creating. So I think it's just the mindfulness and the why that we cannot lose sight of.
Yeah, I think, yes, tech innovation happens at such a rapid rate, to the point where I think if you try to even keep track of headlines, you just can't. There's a difference between, okay, this is happening, so what's our strategic approach to experimenting, to learn by doing, versus I think seeing something and then feeling that pressure to react immediately.
Yeah.
I think it doesn't have to be that it's either you've launched something or you're doing nothing. I think we do live in a world where it feels super binary. Either you are not ready or you are doing it and it's on every headline and things like that, versus I think what we're talking about is that in between, where you might be learning by doing, understanding the best use cases that make sense for your business, whether it's for consumers, understanding data ethics and data privacy, and understanding your responsibility of what data you're going to be using and what data you'll be getting and how you plan to use that, as well as understanding if you're using AI internally, like use case again, and how is it setting up your teams and your organization for success, more from a knowledge-based setting versus like go do it kind of
Yeah.
thing. I think, and I think the reality is that at some moments you do have to go open the thing and go try it. That's
Yeah.
real. But I think we are past that, right? Like AI has been out for, I mean, first of all, AI is not a new thing. That's
No.
a different that's a different conversation. But I think as soon as Gen AI has really taken off in mass media and in mass access, we have seen people experiment. So I think we are beyond that point of conversation of asking people to go try it. I think now it's really making sure there's intentionality and people understand, like, okay, if my organization wants me to use it, why are we using it? How are we using it? Where do you want me to use it? What are the legal implications that I need to know about? When are we saying we are not going to use it? What are the guardrails around it that we are
Yeah.
agreeing upon and aligning with? So all of those things, right? So I think, like, to your point around vision setting for futures thinking, I can see that same approach of thinking
Yeah.
about, like, here are the things that are emerging around us, whether it's technology, categorical innovation, human behaviors, economics, right? Like, and policy changes that's going to directly impact us. And out of that, what are the things we want to be prepared for? What inspires us? What are some new challenges that maybe didn't exist for our consumers before that we
Exactly.
want to be the people to solve it for them? And how do we approach that? So I love that tension between, sure, there's risks involved, of course, but also inspired to create and navigate that emergence from a place of, like, problem solving.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say
So
so.
I think, like, now bringing all of this into a more practical place. So if a product team or a strategist or a business leader wants to apply futures thinking into their work, what's a low, I mean, maybe low lift is not the right word. What's an accessible real world way to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately I would actually start with the fact that most of Future's work focuses squarely on plausibility. So, what is
Mm-hmm.
believable
Mm-hmm.
and, possibility in terms of statistical analysis and likelihoods and things like that. What I would actually encourage people to do is to delve into the area of Future's work that we actually spend the least amount of time in, which is what is the preferred future? What is the future you
Mm-hmm.
actually want? And that is not an easy conversation for lots of teams to have together, but I think that is a starting point. What is the future that we actually are trying to design for?
Yep.
Who are the people
I love
that
that.
we want to cast a spotlight onto, that we care about? Who are the stakeholders? I consider the Earth, planet Earth, Mother Earth, a stakeholder, right? So who are the stakeholders that we want to prioritize, whose perspectives we need to capture? Like, what are areas that we can learn from? Another really thing, like, simple way that I encourage people to delve into this work is try spending some time learning about an industry you've never occupied before, right? Because you can kind of see, like, look at some of the issues they're dealing with, or look at some of the trends maybe that they're paying attention to, or some of the things that are disrupting their space. And what you start to see is, like, there are a lot of things that we all across different sectors have in common. And there are a lot of things that we're all trying to navigate. And so the more you can kind of get in that habit of, one, unpacking what it is that you actually want,
Mm-hmm.
what are those human elements that we need to start paying more attention to? What's the kind of world we're trying to cultivate for ourselves and each other? And then what's happening in other spaces that could pique your curiosity in new ways about things that are evergreen, right?
Yeah.
Things that are not super trendy and following these sort of hype cycles, but things that really start to show you, like, there are patterns across the world. Like, people are dealing with, for example, communications issues. We just did a whole research project on the future of how we communicate and connect. And this was cross industry
Mm-hmm.
when we were starting to see, some of the challenges, but also the opportunity spaces there. I would also encourage people to really think about the stories they tell themselves about the future, right? So
Oh,
whether
okay.
that's through media consumption, whether that's through just biases, or maybe you've always had one lens on the future, maybe you're inherently an optimistic person or inherently a pessimistic person. I like the point you made earlier about binaries, because I don't think the future is either positive or negative. It just is. And it's all about
Mm-hmm.
how we participate in it and how we can start to put pieces of ourselves into it. But maybe if you lean into one of those lenses, try adopting a different lens, just to see
Mhm.
things through so that you can start to challenge what does inform how I think about the future, or the leanings that I may have, and how do I now start to push myself to think outside of my norms, right? Because that's a lot of what futures work is about. And then I would say for folks that are more interested in kind of some of the tips from a business perspective, I would really encourage people to really, as we are solving for risk management and things like that, to really lean into more resiliency practices. And what that means is everything that we said about strategy. Part of how we
Mhm.
can gain more resilience in the business environment is by having just more robust strategies, right? In terms of what are we solving for? Why do we exist? What are the values that guide our decision making? What are the capabilities that are needed here? Who are the people that we have here that we can really leverage? Like, not losing that human power is something I would I will be beating that drum until the end of time. Like, we cannot lose just our innately human capabilities of being able to bring in cultural
Mhm.
lenses, bringing in philosophy, bringing in psychology, like all of the things that we sort of innately understand because we've had to navigate the world. How do
Right.
we use that to inform, the kinds of strategies that are going to be rooted in more of a human-centered practice? Because at the end of the day, the users, the clients, the partners, the investors, everyone that you are engaging with are people. And
Mhm.
ultimately, your ability to connect with them and to come up with plans together and to have that sort of resiliency that we need to navigate lots of just converging realities and lots of scary times is really going to rely on your ability to speak to their needs and their abilities to
Yes.
speak to yours. And so that kind of capability, that kind of strategy, that kind of ability to think about beyond your industry, just what is happening in the world and how it can start to shape the sort of markets that you may go after, or the way you may position yourself in a market that you've been in for a really long time. There are a whole host of practical applications for this kind of work, but just as a person, those would be some of the things that I would challenge people to do. And the last thing I would say is, like, honestly, spend some time in nature and spend some time
Touch
reading
grass.
fiction. Touch
Touch
grass
some
and read some
grass.
fiction to
Yeah.
really just expand that muscle of being able to, get comfortable with that sort of discomfort of dealing with abstract concepts or creativity or speculation. Just be open to those things, because it really feels like in some ways it has nothing to do with work, but I promise you it has everything to do with work and how you're able to show up in a time that requires presence,
Yeah.
and requires an open mind.
Absolutely. I think, like, as you said that, the other thing it made me think of is like holding space for two conflicting truths to
At the same
coexist, right?
time,
Like, I
yeah.
think I think we are so comfortable in like taking a side. Like, what's your point of view on this technology? What's your point of view on this?
Yeah.
Versus like understanding as human beings, we're constantly in tension, right? Like, one example, I mean, the biggest example is like the fact that running Gen AI costs a lot to our Earth. That is not speculative. That is truth.
That's true.
There's a ton of work that's proving that. And at the same time, generative AI has unlocked a lot of creative potential for individuals who wanted to create something, do something, and now they can. I think, like, if people could just hold space for the fact that those two conflicting truths are coexisting right now, and that's the reason why people are so in tension and trying to figure out, like, what do I do about that? I think, like, holding space for parallel truths will also be like super imperative. Let me share an example. In 2016, Lego partnered with the Institute for the Future to explore how play, sustainability, and digital behavior might evolve over the next 15 years. But they weren't just chasing trends, they were asking deeper questions like, what kind of world will kids grow up in? What values will matter then? And how should creativity evolve in a hybrid physical digital future? And that level of foresight informed long term investments from them, from experimenting with biodegradable bricks to launching augmented reality integrated sets like Lego Hidden Side and expanding globally inclusive storytelling. I think more importantly, they started to build, or they enhanced their internal systems, like the creative play lab, that moved them beyond reactive product launches into more proactive, future-oriented design, really owning the future that they wanted to help facilitate in creating. So they were no longer just responding to what kids want. They were preparing for the world that these kids will help shape, and and the role they want to play in that, right? So that's what futures thinking enables, more of a long-term orientation, intentional trade-offs that you want to make, and decisions that grow more relevant over time. It's not about being first. It's about being much closely aligned with where the world is heading and where you want to be in relation to that before the world even gets there. So as we wrap up, as the name of the podcast is Unmissables. So what is one unmissable signal or shift you think more people should pay attention to?
I am very fascinated by the sudden requirements that a lot of companies have to bring people back to the office full time. And the reason I'm paying attention to that, and I do think it's an unmissable signal, is because I want people to pay attention to how quickly things become normalized. And then we kind of get comfortable and it becomes the status quo. And then it becomes time to shift to something else. And I think this is a perfect example. Like, as a person who's been working remotely since 2018, before I think a lot of people really were able to do that or experience that, it was always normal
before
to
the
me.
pandemic.
Yeah,
right?
before the pandemic. Yeah, it was normal to me because I had always been afforded the opportunity of working for global companies and things like that. I had that flexibility. But it's just so interesting that during the pandemic, what we saw was productivity skyrocketed, simply not only because people were spending more time at home and therefore doing work, but it's also because, like, people just had more ways of connecting and, were able to just find different ways of working that worked for them. And that sort of ability to personalize and customize how they work and when they work and where they work, it really allowed people, I think, to be a bit more committed to showing up and delivering and focusing on the outcomes, and not so much of the kind of office politics or the chit chat or things that become these intangible ways that our performance are measured. And so productivity skyrocketed during the pandemic. And so now that we are on the other end of that, I think it's really fascinating to see how the narrative around collaboration or productivity is completely shifting back, tethering itself back to the status quo that you must be full-time in office to be an engaged and productive, to this organization. So I'm paying attention to that because I think a lot of these kinds of realities are not necessarily grounded in a truth of sorts. I think a lot of them are grounded in narrative. And that's why I'm so hell-bent on supporting people with reshaping their narrative of the future, for example, because the narrative is what controls our behavior, right? The vision we have is what dictates our decision making. And so as I start to see a signal like that, that tells me, okay, there's a pervasive narrative that we have to circumvent and we have to start to work through to challenge this kind of culture of, I would argue, control that pushes the return to office because it's not consistent with what the data is telling us.
It's so interesting you're talking about that. I think narrative, and then it makes me think about your point around what's the preferred future. Is this supporting whatever is the preferred future of these organizations? Tameka, it's been truly an honor to have this conversation with you. It has been everything I knew it would be and so much more.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Ariba. You take care.
Thanks for listening to the Unmissables with Ariba Jahan podcast. If today's conversation sparked something new or made you think differently, be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. And if you're enjoying the show, please consider leaving us a rating or review. It really helps more listeners find us. For past episodes, show notes, and the Unmissables I'm paying attention to, subscribe to the newsletter on Substack or visit unmissableswithariba.com. See you on the next episode.